to another episode of Remotely Speaking Up. And this week we are joined by Khadija Moore, founder of Digitalize and Organizational and Development Manager of Global Sales, Marketing and Distribution at Gildan. Don't say that fast 5 times. It's so lovely to have you with us, Khadija. And Khadija's here today to tell us a bit more about learning and development and how that's an organizational design and how that is changing as a result of what we're seeing in our workforce, those workforce changes and trends. So welcome, Khadija. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Rochelle. Absolute pleasure to be here. Absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're welcome.
So, I can just tell you a bit about myself. So as Rochelle mentioned, I have a company, Digitalize, where I'm the founder, managing director. And what that really is a bit of a boutique consulting company where I provide OD strategy, OD solutions, a lot of them which are digital for our modern workforce. So for companies pretty much across the globe at this point. And in addition to that, my 9 to 5 is at Gildan. And as she said, I also do a bit of organizational development there. And I cover our global SMD. That's how we say it. So you don't have to say sales, marketing, and distribution. So our global SMD locations. Yeah,
you should have told me that earlier. I think
my apologies. It's much easier that way. But yeah, so that's what I cover. So everything related to organizational development. So there's a bit of talent management, there's learning and development, there's a bit of workforce planning and things like succession planning, performance management, and employee engagement, which has become really big recently, employee experience. So that's kind of my portfolio.
Wow, a portfolio is right. That's a lot of things that you covered just in one breath. And that's your 9 to 5. And you have this company outside as well. I think actually you're a perfect reflection of how the world of work is changing with more people in this sort of dual careers and portfolio careers. So I know that you're in fact, just for our audiences, let's take a step back. We talk a lot about HR and human resource management, human resource development. Where does OD fit into that? What are we talking about when we say organizational development?
Oh my goodness, that's such a big question. And I think that's still a debate in the OD community. What is OD? Like that is like the taboo question of the day. Like you can get into that question. But as it relates to, I guess, in relation to HR, they're pretty much very interrelated. So OD looks at things like, I would say like change management and really organizational efficiency and competitiveness from a people perspective. So things like structure. So we do things like technostructural interventions, things like human process interventions. So individual interventions, group, team building, that kind of stuff. And we also look at, like, I would say strategy, so supporting the people strategy aspect as well. So OD is in and of itself a big portfolio, especially in the organization and linked to HR. But on its own, I would say it's really about that science and practice of more or less organizational effectiveness. And there's a big component of change management there as well.
Yeah, I imagine there's a lot to do with productivity and efficiency and making the workforce suitable for that as well.
Absolutely.
And where does Digitalize come in, your company?
So Digitalize is kind of like I want to say my baby. Like I launched that years ago, and it kind of came back because there was demand around the whole pandemic time as well. So what I do there is a lot of companies will reach out and say, we have this OD problem, or we have this area that we think needs an OD solution. And I would kind of pretty much just strategize around that, either in tandem with their HR lead. So it's a lot of like HR support who may not have like an in-house OD resource, kind of offering them services that way. And also a lot of other digital solutions. So things like ebooks and guides and resources for their teams or things that they will use with employees as well. That's the bulk of what I do through Digitalized.
Okay. So what are you seeing as some of the changes? Because I know you see it on both ends. You're in Barbados, but you consult from there globally. And we've seen with the pandemic that has increased, where not only like yourself, there's more persons freelancing in addition to their full-time jobs, but also the general mix of the workforce is changing. you now have a more hybrid workforce. So persons are working more hybrid, we're embracing more remote work. And then you also are managing people who are choosing also to work in different ways, whether that's with the company as a contractor or freelancer rather than full-time. So with those sort of changes in the OD space, and I know you are rather globally informed and you operate globally with your business, how does that affect the space of OD?
That's a good question. So I would say you see a lot of, in terms of OD and OD practitioners, a lot of us are working remotely. We don't have to be in office 5 days a week, 9 to 5, because of the way we do a lot of what we do. But for the most part, what I've seen is that there's a bit of a hybrid mix. In terms of impacting OD and OD solutions in the organization or in organizations pretty much across the globe, there is a bit of what I say, the funny analogy that I would use to reference it is kind of like a relationship. So you usually have the guy in the relationship who was like, let's do things this way, pretty much very, I don't want to say unemotional, but how typical that can be. And then you tend to have the person in the relationship who is no touchy-feely, that kind of stuff. And I think if you look at it in terms of like work design and how we're designing work, a lot of organizations are looking at the re-engineering of their processes in terms of rethinking how work is done. And they're looking at it in terms of restructuring these business processes pretty much around productivity and the digital, I guess, influx we can say that we've seen in the last 2 years. And then you have employees, I don't want to say they're the touchy-feely ones, but they're kind of the persons that are saying, I want to see a bit more job enrichment for me. So it's almost at 2 different ends of the spectrum. And that's why I kind of deal with it in relationships. You tend to have that person that is very matter of fact. Sometimes you have both touchy-feely persons. It does happen, right? And
so you're kind of like, you're the marriage counselor in between.
Pretty much. So I'm there in marriage counseling, pretty much just negotiating and kind of trying to wade through what's the balance, because there needs to be a balance of both. And I think from an OD perspective, as we say, we always seek to drive positive change from a people perspective. How can we really marry the two in a way that is meaningful to both the company and its bottom line, as well as to people and what they want out of life and their ever evolving needs as well.
Wow, that's quite a hard balance to strike. It's like you're trying to please 2 masters at once. I imagine must be very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what about let's say in doing that, what do you see are the things that companies struggle with the most as they're trying to prepare for this new sort of context?
I think it's battling through change. I mean, most people are resistant to change in some way or another. And it's kind of encouraging people to think about, what is the outcome that I want? What does it look like? Reimagine, rethink the future and what that should look like, and kind of get in there. And I heard, I'm trying to remember, there's this really good saying that people don't move unless where they are is more uncomfortable than where they're going. And I think people like where they are, it's comfortable, this is the way I've always done things, but kind of getting persons to see, there's bigger benefits to changing and adopting new practices, adopting new ways of doing things and moving forward. So it's always that kind of like that struggle between, here is comfortable. This is what I've known for 20 years. This is what I've known for 40 years. And how do I move into what's next? So I think that's kind of like one of the biggest hiccups you tend to face from a people perspective. And then there is, in the adapting of that, of course, there's, for me, who my background was traditionally L&D, there's that skills perspective as well that kind of comes in. So persons are saying, well, I've used Excel all my life. What is this other tool you want me to use, kind of thing. So it's an interesting intermingling of a lot of different factors, but I find getting persons to kind of embrace new skills as well. It's also definitely another challenge. And then as fast as you embrace a new skill, you need another one. Right? So getting people in that mode for continuous learning is definitely a critical piece.
I feel like every single week on the show, I say it's about mindset. It's always about mindset. And I feel like so many times in that digital space as well, where we're tackling digital transformation, and we've heard from all the reports that more than 80% of companies fail in that area. And it always is exactly down to what you said, getting people to actually embrace the change. And it's a funny thing with L&D as well, because I think there's always this fear of when the company changes, it means that there'll be a reduction of jobs or certain jobs will disappear. So then that kind of comes, that makes people naturally resist as well. Have you
And I
seen?
think even if jobs don't disappear, there's this concern in that I become less valuable. And I've spent so much of my time, whether it be building up my value to the company in terms of social capital or skills capital, whatever way I've done so, right? So it's not just I lose my job, but I lose something that is of value to me, because my ability, whether we think it is vain or not, my ability to add value to the company may be something a person takes absolute pride in, right?
Yeah.
And to lose that is definitely a hard conversation to have, or the fear of losing that, because that's not necessarily true, is it? But it's that fear that is kind of in it in persons for sure.
I like that. I don't really hear that perspective quite often. And you're absolutely right, because it's almost like you're asking people to start with a blank slate again. And that can be very intimidating in itself. And then the actual pressure of learning and then applying the learning as well.
Yeah, for sure. It's this, there's going to be a learning curve, and there's a starting point on the learning curve. Yes, they're going to go up and it's going to be great, but there's that starting point, and that brings such fear and resonates in such a negative way with persons oftentimes. So it's kind of thinking about how do I as a leader, how does this company get buy-in from the people, and how can the company support persons in that transition as well?
So what would you advise to, let's say, persons who manage people? As you were just talking about the leaders. So what about HR leaders and business leaders, or those who are involved with people management? What should they be looking to do in that space?
Oh dear. I think it starts with getting to know people, having those critical conversations. You're going to have to spend some time reassuring your team, seeing what and understanding what they value. And a lot of times when I talk to leaders, I always say this, and they look at me like I'm a crazy person. I promise you I'm not, but figuring out what motivates your people and what values them is crucial to everything you'll do in your leadership of them, right? So what makes them tick, what inspires them, what gets them up in the morning, and kind of leveraging that, and or seeing how you can leverage that as you lead them through change is really important.
I agree. And I think sometimes what hinders that as well is you can find that, what do I want to say, like the influence of the organizational culture, or the accepted way of managing. I know a lot of companies, and in a lot of Caribbean islands, we're used to a very sort of paternalistic, authoritarian sort of management. And when now we're talking about, well, getting to know the employees, creating a more experimental space, then I know there's this fear also on the leader side about giving up control. Or one person said to me before, well, if I do that, I'll appear soft. I don't want to appear soft to the employees.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's also, so there's a fear of kind of like appearing soft, but there's also that, like, this is just new to me. How do I navigate it? This doesn't match with my style. How do I marry it into my style? And I always tell persons when I'm doing my leadership training, for example, I'm not trying to create a 180. I'm trying to teach you some critical skills that you can apply, how you see fit, when it's needed, and create a bit more of a flexible approach. And it's definitely needed, I would say, in the Caribbean, but you see it far and wide and beyond, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So where should they start? What would you say in that space are the top 3 skills? Because we're talking about reskilling employees. We're talking about what leaders should watch out for as well. What should be the top 3 skills that HR leaders should be trying to enhance to make this more possible?
Wow. Top 3 skills HR for themselves, in themselves?
Yeah, to achieve the things that you say we need to achieve. Just in your opinion.
I would say metrics. And I would say metrics because if you don't know where you are, and you can't measure it, you can't track it. Right. So I'm always big on like measuring and tracking. And I remember like every time I join an HR team, I'm like, how do you measure that? How are you tracking that? How do you know that's true? Can you prove it? Do you have a number for that?
That's like that saying, it's like if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And
exactly,
that's
right?
true. Yeah.
So I think people analytics, and then there's the question of what to measure in it. But I think you think about your outcomes. What's the outcome you want to achieve, and then what are some metrics you can put in place to kind of track that? So I say metrics for HR leaders. In terms of what other skills can I talk about for HR leaders? You've put me on the spot with that one.
No, I'll take two.
I say coaching. A lot of times
I would agree.
The HR journey, we tell people what to do. Leaders come to us and they're like, I have this issue with my employee or whatever the case may be. And we kind of just give them the answers. So we don't build that bench strength that we need from our leaders. So what we need to do is kind of get better at coaching. What are some things that I can do to improve my coaching skills? And there are two things that you can do to improve your coaching skills, which is just ask better questions. So don't give the answer, ask questions to kind of help to guide them there, and then just active listening, right? So those are two things that will help you to kind of build those coaching skills.
In terms of I think you make a really interesting point there when you mention about the outputs and concentrating on the outputs, because I think that in itself is a shift that a lot of companies are still coming to grips with, because so often, especially when we're talking about new ways of working, often we associate work with being in one place and being present there. And now we're saying you're working remotely, you're working hybrid, or maybe you're working independently as a contractor or a consultant. I know the company is struggling with, well, how do we know our money is worth it and we're paying them what we should? And you're very much right in that point about focusing on outputs and not the process. I think so hard we try to manage how people are doing things rather than looking at the actual results.
Absolutely. And it's a conversation you can have until the end of time. Again, it's another mindset change.
Yep.
It's another mindset shift and change and all of that great stuff, right? But yeah, I mean, managers are accustomed or have been traditionally accustomed, not all of them, but many of them, managing persons by hours. Right. So if I see Rochelle in her chair for 40 hours a week, I know she's a good employee. If I see her for 48, she's a great employee.
When 40 of those hours might be on Facebook.
Exactly, right? And people are skilled in the art of looking busy.
Yeah.
So it's really about output. And I think we have to help, as HR leaders, help managers to think about what is the output that is required. And they do oftentimes need a bit of support. I have managers that would come to me, or even external companies. People would just come to me and say, hey, I'm having this problem with this employee. And I say, is she doing the work? Is the work complete? Is it being completed on time? Okay, so think about it. Do you really have an issue here?
I hope that's where the light bulb comes on.
They're like dumbfounded. They're like, you probably don't. You have a preference, and that's okay. We all have our preferences. I have a preference of how I like employees to show up. Employees have a preference as it relates to how they want their managers to show up, but we've got to be flexible.
Yeah. Right.
And I think if we let outputs and outcomes, as that's the thing we really want, we're better able to be flexible in other areas, right? So for me, I'm not a morning person, I'm a night person, right? So I heard a person say one time, you need to be able to manage energy. It's better that you manage the energy of your team and figuring out how you can do that. I'm just like, what? And when they explain it so beautifully. I'm sure that
that sounds like Perry Timms. He's the energy guy when it comes to HR.
but it's important, right? Because that, like, for me, my hours of productivity are somewhere between 10 p.m. and 3 a.m. Like, that's it. 10 p.m. and 3 a.m. I can work until, great work, great output, creativity. That's when I work best. But I find for that's not the case for everyone. Some people work well in the morning, etc. And I think if you kind of treat people as human, and going back to that people-centric aspect, you're able to get better outputs anyways. And if the outputs is the goal, you're golden.
Yeah, and I think I long for the day when companies truly embrace that, because it's such a shame to see that after everything that's happened in the last 2 years. Now, on the other side, I can't even say we're fully on the other side, but still coming out of it, you have these big bosses all over the world that you think should know better that are now saying, get back in the office. Remote workers are lazy. Remote workers are, it's horrible to see, because it's like a regression of everything that you've actually learned.
Yeah, and I think that just thinking about like remote work and looking at organizational design and even leveraging things like contract workers and persons, freelancers, etc. If we get away from managing butts and seats into managing outputs, you'll be better able to leverage those types of resources, much to the benefit of the company, right?
Absolutely. Just going back to organizational design as well, what do you think are some of the key changes or ways that organizations can innovate, given that they're working now with such a new mix or blend of people, or blends of work approaches, let's put it that way?
So what are some things that they can do?
Yeah, in terms of, let's say, the organizational design. So let's say you have more persons working from home, some working from the office a few days a week. Is there anything in terms of the organizational design and infrastructure that you can do to better accommodate that?
Obviously, there's a technology component, and I think a lot of companies, believe it or not, are doing that aspect of it better. I think the part that is not so clear is the people component. There's been not enough, but a good set of research has come out that shows that when you leave hybrid work arrangements open to employees, certain subsets of employees are disadvantaged. So I know, as much as people are saying, you know, like, give me hybrid, let me choose my days, for example, you know, that can be detrimental to certain people. Women who may be at home taking care of kids, etc., may be feeling that burden and we say, okay, well, I just want to come into the office 2 days a week. Men who may have that support system at home may say, okay, I'll work 5 days, I'll work 4 days, 4 days. So then there's a mismatch, or there's a disparity between, again, people who are looking to see butts and seats.
First class and second class workers, almost.
Yes, absolutely. So I think that we have to be mindful. One of the things that I really like to put out there is be mindful of how we look at visibility in addition to output, right? So is it a case that how do we recognize achievements and visibility and all of that kind of stuff? So there's an element of like recognition and reward, etc., that is tied closely into this. And I think that companies have to spend more time looking at that to make sure that people are not disadvantaged or even disenfranchised because of hybrid work and those kind of systems that we're putting in place, or rather we have to put systems in place.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think also to kind of address that as well, there's a lot to be said for innovation in the way in which you redesign office spaces as well. Because if it is that your workforce is changing, you have some people come in and some people going, maybe it might need for a sort of restructuring of the space in a way that you don't create that, as you said, in terms of that focus on visibility, that focus on who's in and so forth. So I know a lot of offices, for example, are doing, they're getting really creative in the space where they're thinking about, okay, how can we create, let's say, redesign this office to be more of a social space. So when employees come and pop in and go, and it's not a matter of who's here all day and who's not. So I think there's room for creativity there as well.
Absolutely. So kind of making sure that the focus is more collaboration than like, this is Khadija's seat. I haven't seen Khadija in her seat, her assigned seat for, 2, 3 days, 4 days, what have you. Yeah,
I agree.
So that's part of the system that you put in place to kind of support that, right? So figuring out, okay, what does my office space look like? Would be a good, one of the ways. So there are a couple of things to kind of tick the boxes on, but I think that just being mindful of, I'm not disadvantaging anyone as I kind of implement that hybrid and remote work for our people.
Yeah, and you have to have that mindset going in rather than thinking about it after.
After the fact, right?
Yeah.
Which is kind of what we're doing because of COVID. We kind of just made the quick shift, and now we're thinking about, okay, these are some things that I need to have in after the fact.
Yeah, just reflecting on it now that you have the time to actually think about it, which is good in a way, because as you said, it's like we're responding to panic, but now you actually have the time to look back and see what was good and what wasn't. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Tanisha. I'm going to edit out. I almost called you Tanisha. I have a friend named Tanisha.
That's okay. Yeah. That's okay.
Thank you so much, Khadija, for joining us. And just before we go, of course, you said you're going to share with us your funniest remote work story. So do tell. I heard this one is a doozy. No pressure.
I've heard this happen to other people as well. So hopefully, I'm sure I'm not alone. So I started my job at Gildan, and I started remotely. So I started, renting, I got my laptop, my office equipment, that kind of stuff, came home, set up. So I was working remotely for probably about 7 months before going into the office. So on my first day in the office, I'm walking in, people are looking at me really weird. They're like, so I'm thinking, what's going on? What's going on? One brave person comes up and says, I thought you were tall.
Oh,
seeing you on the screen all day, every day. I thought you were like 5'9", 5'10", maybe 6 foot tall. Your voice is so big. I thought you were a tall person.
I feel that's a compliment in a way. It's kind of like a double-edged sword, that one. It could be an insult, but it could also be a compliment.
Yeah, and they're all 5'5" standing up saying, I've dealt with wanting to be tall all my life. This is hitting me in all the soft spots. Like, what are you guys doing? And I heard it like for the first 3 weeks, like every time I met new people, oh, I thought you were tall. I thought you were going to be tall. There was something about you that I thought was tall.
The camera does that for you, though. You can hide all these things that you don't necessarily want people to see, but the camera have a good angle.
So I like the idea that remotely working, I'm a tall person.
Nice. So if I ever meet you in person, I have that expectation. Don't mention her height.
Don't mention my height. No, don't do it. Don't. And I was wearing heels when they said, so I was like, how much taller did you want me to be?
Is there a requirement to work here?
Yeah, so that was my every time I started on the board remotely as well. So when I met them in person, I was like, you're a short person. So
when you put it like that, it does sound insulting. Like nothing's wrong with being short, but when you say it like that.
Yeah, it's really, so that's my funny remote work experience. Nothing else too embarrassing, just the height.
Don't believe me, trust me, we've had all the pants down stories, so that's refreshing. It's nice to mix it up a bit every once in a while.
Yeah, happy to mix it for you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And Khadija, just tell us, our audience, before we go, where can they find you?
Oh my goodness, you can find me on LinkedIn. I think that's where most people find me. And from LinkedIn, you can have pretty much all of my contact information there if you want to find me. But LinkedIn is probably the best place to find me, for sure.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Khadija, for joining us and for really just giving us a better understanding of what we mean by OD. Because as you said, people know of OD in the HR space, but often I think there's a very sort of basic or generalized understanding of what that actually involves. So especially in this new context that we've been talking about, I think you've made it make a lot more sense. So thank you so much for that. Yeah. Well,
my pleasure.
Awesome. So thank you again. And thank you to our audiences for listening. And if you want to find Khadija, that is Khadija Moore on LinkedIn, Khadija. Is that right?
There we go.
Yes. Test. Almost failed. So that's Khadija Moore on LinkedIn. So take care. And thank you again for joining us for another episode of Remotely Speaking Up. Bye.